All right, it is day 2 of our Wandering in the Wilderness Lenten Bible study. Um, and we want to jump into being in the wilderness. Yesterday was just your intro video. Now we're going to get serious. Our passage that we're looking at is from Exodus chapter 15, verses 22 through 27. And before I get to our first couple of verses to look at today, imagine where the Exodus starts, where it's not only getting freed from Egypt, it is the journey that begins at that point. Freedom from slavery meant wandering out into the wilderness and following a new path with only one leader that supposedly has a connection to God, and it takes quite a leap of faith to do that. So that's where we find the Israelites, probably traumatized from being enslaved for years and now setting off with nothing secure before them except for what they've seen that God has been able to do for them and what they have heard from Moses. So that's what little they jump off with. So the very end, and when they know that they have received their freedom, is as they're crossing the Red Sea and the waters part for them and provide them safety and security to cross over, but it does cover up all of Pharaoh's people. Pharaoh's army is gone. It is covered and they're gone. Once they leave this point, they know they are free. And this is where we'll pick up with our first 2 verses today. Starting verse 22. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" So again, there must have been some sort of euphoria just in knowing they were finally free, but some uncertainty as well as they all just keep walking and wander into the wilderness, into the desert. So the first thing you need is the security of food, water, shelter. They go in search of water. Now again, it's been just 3 days into this journey. So whatever euphoria was there probably faded at this point. Whatever they thought, okay, we can do this, and they're just excited and they're just ready to jump into their new life. Now they're frustrated and they're hitting that breaking point because they haven't had enough fresh water and they have to search for the essentials. So 3 days in, we find panic when they need to find water. And what do they find?
Yeah, 3 days in, 3 days from jubilation. That's about how long it takes to really forget all of that, doesn't it? And so they start sniping. Moses, what are we going to drink? And then Moses is kind of frustrated with God too. What are we going to drink? And then, off in the distance, they see water. I imagine that was a pretty exciting moment. That at that point, they were really happy. This feels like salvation. This feels like this is what we've been looking for. I bet they ran towards Marah. And when they got there, they discovered that the water was not sweet. The water was bitter. It was brackish water. It was stagnant water. It was water that was bitter. They were disappointed. They were frustrated. What had looked good from a distance, now they could see wasn't as good as they thought. What had looked like salvation from a distance, what had looked like what we really need, wasn't what would save them. So what do? How do you deal with that disappointment? How do you engage when what you had hoped for doesn't come?
We hear the Israelites asking those questions, but I think those questions are the same for us today. There are times when we find ourselves bitterly disappointed. There are times when we look forward and we make plans and we look up and there's something great on the horizon, but it actually is harmful for us. Think even simply in terms of a wonderful donut with wonderful icing, and it looks good. It probably even tastes good, but it's harmful. It's not what our body is meant to really divulge into. We need balance and health, and we need nutrients. We don't just need a sugar high. We need something more than that. We need sustenance. And so even on a small level, that helps us to think about what the questions the Israelites were asking themselves. Because they were looking for the good stuff, but they found things that sometimes were harmful. And we have to wonder how would we handle those disappointments? If we had been in that group wandering in the wilderness, how would we have handled all of that? But also, you and I have disappointments every day. How do we manage them? What do we do to get through? Where do we turn to for help? Where do we find our support? What helps manage us? What helps us to turn to those disappointments and to react faithfully?
It's really interesting. You talk about donuts.
Yeah.
Donuts don't seem bitter. They seem sweet. If you make your diet exclusively of donuts, that might lead to a bitter stomach.
Yeah, like, he tries, folks. He tries.
It's early in Lent. We have just begun. And maybe already in the Lenten practices you've undertaken, you have already failed. Maybe you gave up donuts.
And then Heather talked about donuts and you went and ate some.
It happens.
It does.
It happens. It seemed like a good idea at the time to say, I'm giving up donuts. It's not as good when you pass Krispy Kreme and the hot and now sign is on. It seemed like a good idea at the time to say, I'm going to wake up early. I'm going to wake up early and I'm going to read my Bible and I'm going to pray. That sounds sweet. But then when early morning comes, the warm bed and the pillow also sound sweet. What do we do when we fail? Do we get frustrated? Do we give up? Do we say, I never could do this. This is just another time that I failed. Maybe that's not the approach we need to take. This isn't about whether you give up donuts. This isn't about whether you drag yourself out of bed. This is about preparing yourself to find God's mercy. And if you're always successful, you probably won't need God's mercy. But we're not always successful. God didn't come to save people who are always successful. It's not always about what we do. It's about what God does. It's about the fact that Jesus comes. That's what Lent's about. That's what we're preparing for. Is so that we understand that Jesus comes. Jesus has mercy. In that mercy, that's permission to re-engage. Not to give up, not to be frustrated, but to come back to those practices not as some sort of punishment, not as some sort of training, but as an opportunity to be in contact, in relationship with God. That's what we're going for. That's where our hope is. So, if you've failed already, ask forgiveness and come back to that discipline. See what happens this time.
The Israelites were just beginning to figure this out and to ask questions and to wonder and to realize how much they needed God and God's mercy and learning to rely on the fact that God would provide. We will keep wandering in the wilderness and keep exploring this, and we'll look to the rest of this scripture passage from Exodus 15 in the next video. See you tomorrow.